Office of Scholarship and Innovation at the Teachers College at Arizona State, where we do, supporting faculty research, digital solutions for learning, and also what we call hacking educational systems by design, something that I will talk a little bit about. So I'm really excited, that's me, to be here in Australia. I was here back in 2012, where both Matt Gator and I had come here. There was this big project called Teaching Teachers for the Future, and so that was the first time I was in Australia. Love cricket, being originally from India. I won't rub it in about India winning the series, but I will now. So we missed watching the match here in Sydney last week, so hopefully we can get a big Bash League game later this week. So excited about that. Growing up in India, I used to listen to this band, because they had this one line, which is the Met a Man from Bombay. This is Men at Work, from the land down under. And they were had these lyrics such as buying bread from a man in Brussels. He was 6'4" and full of muscles. It's okay. But he had this thing about they had this lyric about a Vegemite sandwich. And I remember last time I came, I actually tried it. Not my thing. So sorry about that. So another connection, Sean mentioned, was coming in for the MITE conference in 2015, where I was a keynote speaker with Bill Rankin, and I think I'm looking a little more like Bill 5 years. And made some really good friends there. Bill, of course, Sean, but Bean Lederman, who does this amazing work using cell phones and macro photography, and she got me hooked into it, and Smita and my kids can attest to that for the next few years, I was just crawling around every nook and corner, taking pictures of bugs and things around me, so that sort of was one of those transformational things. And here we are, both of us looking so much younger back then. But the problem is that Sean sort of says all these things about how good I am at presenting and so on. So I feel a sense of pressure here today to perform. So my goal is just not to end up that way. Okay, but I mean, it was kind of interesting for me to reflect on this time between 2015 and 2019. And Sean, you talked about the transformation that's happened in your kids' generations, and if you think about it in terms of interesting times. And back in 2015, I actually dug up my old slides and I was looking through them. It was talking about technology in education, what it is that teachers need to know, talked about 21st century learning, talked about this framework that we were developing for 21st century learning around that, that to be educated in today's world, that you need to have foundational knowledge, like what you need to know, you need to have approaches to work on that knowledge, which is how you act on it, but it's creativity, innovation, collaboration, and things that way. And you bring a sense of values, a sort of a humanistic lens, which gives you a sense of why, the purpose for doing this, that all three sort of work together. And sort of thinking about sort of how personal devices have evolved from 2000 BC to today, right? And thinking about this world that we live in that is being increasingly transformed by technology. All these apps and tools, devices all around us, and each of these devices, of course, comes loaded with apps. So, I mean, this device here is not just this thing. It's actually a portal into a whole range of things. And we understood that there were challenges. We understood, for instance, that it's kind of weird that as a species, that we still have to deal with this, that more people have access to cell phones than toilets. That's a tragedy, right? I mean, but we understood that, yeah, the trend was optimistic, it was positive. We were in this time, which was the Arab Spring, when thinking about an undergraduate in Harvard had created this thing called Facebook, or that a couple of guys created this thing called Twitter, and it was being used to form a democracy and so on. And in EdTech, Matthew Kaler and I had developed this framework, which we thought was really useful and powerful, of thinking about technology, pedagogy, and content together, which is sort of known as the TPAC framework, right? That's suggesting that when we think about using technology in educational context, you cannot just think of the tool, you cannot just think of the subject matter, but they have to work integrated together. So it's this idea of a total package. And thinking that this is not something that is true only of digital technologies, that whether you use a slate or use a computer or use the web, that teaching has always been about how we take ideas, conceptual ideas, abstract ideas, practical ideas and convert them in ways that make sense to learners using certain representational powers of tools and technologies, right? So have this sort of sense of that it's that as educators we need to go beyond merely using technology or integrating technology, but that technology can actually allow us to innovate with learning approaches that were not possible before. And we were very thrilled that we were on the right track. And I felt that way. I felt incredibly optimistic, right? And how naive we were. And so today, it's a completely new presentation for me. This is the first time I'm giving this talk, because I think that we live, in interesting times. And turns out that this is supposed to be this Chinese proverb, which is may you live in interesting times. This is a Chinese curse, that may you live in interesting times. Turns out that there never has been a Chinese curse of that nature. It is actually fake news. Right? And I think that's a challenge that we face today. And I want to spend a little bit of time to think about where, as educational technology researchers and scholars, as citizens and parents, we drop the ball. Within 8 months of 2016, a year, we had Brexit. Later in November, we have Donald Trump elected as president. We find out about Russian bots and Twitter hacks. We hear this thing about fake news. We see how Facebook can be weaponized. We see how Twitter can be used in ways that divide us. And Donald Trump is not the only example. We see this in India. We see this in countries around the world. And I think that we have, as educators, have to understand that these tools have been designed to be addictive. And these psychological ideas that we so firmly believe in can be used in very negative and wrong ways. Again, I am not giving a pessimistic view. I am saying that we need to balance, we need to figure a way through this. And so this was my response when I was thinking about it. What just happened? How did we go from 2015, where I didn't feel that I personally was naively optimistic. I was realistic about the situation in the world and this, that, and the other. But I was completely unprepared for the world that I live in today. And so this has been a moment of sort of reflection for me, and an opportunity to really share some of my thoughts about this with all of you. Again, I don't think I have any solutions to offer, but what I do hope I have is foment a conversation about how we as educators can address some of these issues. So to do that, I will share some stories. And a story is a narrative, either true or fictitious, so some of the stuff I say may be fake news, you never know. In prose or verse, designed to interest, amuse, and instruct, and hopefully that'll happen. So I grew up in India. I was born in this place, went to school there, finally ended up getting my undergraduate in electrical engineering. After that, went to design school at the Industrial Design Center, got my master's in design because I wasn't really interested, I think, in in engineering as much. Cared about making educational film and so on. That's where Smita and I first met. And that's where I was introduced to this idea of design. And that's going to be another theme that's going to run through my presentation, is this idea of design. How do we think about the design of these tools so that we can most effectively use them? So this idea of design is essentially that you can go from a thought, from an idea in your head, to an actual thing, and a thing may be a building, it may be an app, it may be a poem, it may be a scientific theory, but it's something that goes from your head, that you work, engage with the world, and you build it. And so after that, took a flight, ended up at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, got my PhD in educational psychology and educational technology. For my dissertation, I looked at one of the greatest artifacts of creation of the human mind, which is the periodic table of elements. And I created a piece of software that allowed students to navigate different representations of the periodic table. How many of you knew that there are 400 plus different representations of the periodic table? We see one on the wall, right? That's truth with a capital T. But turns out chemists have been having a lot of fun creating these different representations. So these are all right in their own way, and they're all incomplete in their own way, because the periodic table is a really complex system of relationships. That one table that we see in our textbooks is just one representation out of many. Right? So this is what I did my dissertation on. And so you can see what I'm leading to is that what I was thinking about when I was thinking about design, when I was thinking about technology, when I was thinking about education, was in terms of that I'm designing artifacts. I'm designing things that students, learners, teachers can engage with, that they can work with and learn from. So that's my first step in thinking about design. Got a job at Michigan State University. Then I found this book called The Media Equation. This was by a couple of professors in Stanford. And they were showing studies, doing studies which showed that people were responding to technology in the ways that we respond to humans. If you haven't read this stuff, you should read this stuff. It's incredibly fascinating. So people were praising computers, people were being polite to computers, people were lying to computers, just as we would do with humans. So that led to a whole line of work that I did for a bunch of years, which we called under the broad label of psychological responses to media. And what we find is that, so we did a whole range of studies on pedagogical software agents, the influence of feedback, accents, wait time. Here's a fascinating study. So the analogy is this. So let's say you're a grad student and you go to a professor's office and you say, I'm interested in this topic. And the professor pulls out a book and hands it to you and says, this is it. You go to another professor's office and you say, I'm interested in this topic. And the professor says, tell me more. Furthers around in the shelf and finally pulls out a book and reads it. No difference in the end outcome of the both. But you're going to feel that the second professor tried harder, worked harder, blah, blah, blah. So we said, okay, would this work for a search engine? So we made a search engine which gave you the results right away, and another one that made you wait for a while. And people trusted the results of the second one more than the first one. Whenever you go on Expedia or you go on Delta.com or whatever, you book an airline ticket, Google can spit results out to you in 0.23 seconds. Why do those sites take so long? They could do it much faster. They're taking advantage of exactly that thing. By making you wait a little bit, they're making you feel that they're working hard for you. You're going to trust, so they are playing with your psychology. And so the key insight that emerged that all interfaces have some kind of a personality. And they can influence how we think and what we do. And I'll come back to this later, but at the same time, there was a professor in Stanford by the name of DJ Fogg. And he had this lab which was called Computers as Persuasive Technologies. And he was arguing that computers and the psychology of persuasion, which we know a lot about, but he had very positive sort of a view of this. So for instance, giving feedback is a very powerful way of changing behavior. We've all seen speed limits which say, 30 kilometers per hour. You just let it go by. But if you have a dynamic one which says the speed limit is 30, you're going at 35, people tend to slow down more. That's a simple use of a technology to persuade you to change your behavior. So that line of work that I was doing was thinking now about design, not just the design of the artifacts, but also the process of the interaction between us, whether it's humans or learners, with those artifacts. But as we were doing this, we were at the same time teaching courses, thinking of that. So if you think about TPAC, it is essentially that you have to go beyond the artifact when you're thinking about teaching the technology. That you have to go beyond the artifact to the processes. What kind of processes are going to play out? But the other thing that we started thinking a lot about is this idea of experience. And this built a lot on John Dewey's work. The belief that all genuine education comes through experience does not mean that all experience are genuinely or equally educated. So the question is, what is an experience that is educated? And one thing we knew, that spoon feeding in the long run teaches us nothing but the shape of the spoon. So how do we design learning experiences for our students? These are usually teachers and teacher educators. And that's where the work, my work moved into, can everybody read this word? Creativity. Can you read it now? Isn't that cool? All right. So a lot of our work then started focusing on how can we become creative with the use of technology in learning. So a whole line of work around creativity emerged. Started thinking about this idea of in-discipline learning, which is learning which is grounded in the disciplines but yet can cross boundaries. So a lot of my work over the past decade or so has been around this work. Started thinking about the aesthetic nature of experience. If you talk to scientists, if you talk to poets, if you talk to mathematicians, mathematicians speak of the elegance of a proof, the beauty of certain ideas, right? And so we've been developing a framework of how one can approach these ideas in learning. Because no scientists, very few scientists say that they do the work that they do, or mathematicians or poets, because they get a lot of money out of it. They speak about things like wonderment, the nature of the journey and the experience, and the fulfillment, the sense of accomplishment, a sense that you're understanding truth, that you're understanding the nature of the universe, and how that can feed into itself and be the self-sustaining virtuous cycle. So this is the third kind of design that now we're looking at. So I'm trying to explain the story of design. He's worried I might just drop it. So thinking about artifacts, that's where I first started from, with engineering and design school, first stage of Michigan State, processes, and experiences. And that brings us to 2016, and the reality, and it hit hard, right? And started thinking about this recurring cycle of hype and despair around technology. That was around the same time that everybody went berserk on this idea of MOOCs, right? This is going to transform education as we know it. And I kept thinking, what is wrong with that? That's the same as having a library. If you have a library in your community, it's the same as having a MOOC. What's the difference? I haven't heard stories of people becoming nuclear physicists because there was a library sitting there. Learning is much more than access to information. But again, we get caught in these hypes and we go on. And so the question is, what have we been missing? And that started this whole conversation and understanding that we need to think about design in terms of systems and culture. And that as educational researchers, as innovators, we have restricted ourselves to artifacts, processes, experiences. We haven't gone beyond that. And the other challenge is what somebody has called the seductive reduction of other people's problems. What does that mean? That's a mouthful. And the analogy is, this person gives in this article, it's a lovely article, look this up, just Google this. He says, imagine a kid, young man in college in Africa, in Kenya, right? And he reads on his phone a news item about gun violence in America. And he's a smart young man, and he says, I think I can solve this. All you have to do is blah, blah, blah. You can pass this legislation, you can do this, you can do that, and I can. So he imagines in his head, he's like, I'm giving TED Talks, I am, the guy who solved the gun problem in America. And sitting in America, honestly, even now the gun issue is one of those things that I can't get my head around. But I know one thing, having lived there for 25 years, that it is a far more complex problem than it looks like sitting somewhere else. And the same thing happens when we sit here and we think about solving problems for education in some other part of the world. There is a seduction in simplifying it and not understanding the local, the context, the ground rules of what's going on there. And so when we think about technology can help us see things in new ways, but only if we see technology in a new way. So let me give you an example of the seduction, right? So everybody knows about Khan Academy, right? All right. So the question is, how does Salman Khan learn stuff? How does he learn? So here's a video. So this is kind of interesting. This was an interview he gave with Charlie Rose, and this is before Charlie Rose showed himself up to be this weird pervert. So I had to actually edit Charlie Lowe's out of all of this because I couldn't stand the sight of seeing him. And so this thing that looks a little chopped because I had to edit him out of all of that. Right? So with that, oops, sorry.
I approach it from what my brain would like to see. Like, what would the ideal? And for me, in history in particular, and I don't feel like I got this in the history books, and even now when I prepare, I'm not getting it from the history books on my shelf, is like, I like to see a scaffold, I like to see a map, I like to, you know, what is the Holy Roman Empire? Like, what is that now?
Well,
like,
the Ottoman Empire.
The Ottoman, what are these things? You know, people can just keep referring to them, but if I can't, so I like to, so what I do is, for history, I immerse myself in as much as possible. I usually read Wikipedia entry first, just to get the scaffold. And the beauty now, also Wikipedia, if I find cool maps along the way, I copy and paste. You know, I make sure they're in the public domain. I copy and paste, stick it on my my little Blackboard art program, and sometimes I'll draw out a timeline just to make sure I get the years right. But the main thing I do, whether it's history or chemistry or anything, is get the scaffold and then really immerse myself for however long it takes, and then make sure that I can make intuitive connections between everything that happens, and, you know, and understand why something, you know, if I'm doing it on the neuron, why, you know, a biology book will tell you, okay, the signal goes across because there's a myelin sheath. And I'd kind of ponder it a bit, and then I was like, well, you know, it's kind of like a fiber optic system, and you can, one's kind of amplifying the signal, but if you amplify too, and then I'd call up some buddies who are either biologists or communications engineers, whatever. I was like, does this make sense? They're like, no, I think you're right. And so it's a big deal for me to, if I'm doing biology, why does the myelin sheath make the signal go faster? If it's history, wait, why did this artillery captain all of a sudden come to power? Like weren't there other people around? Like, these obvious questions are important for me to answer. Yeah. And what's really cool is sometimes you call a buddy and you're like, I know you're going to think I'm stupid when I ask you this, and you're probably going to think I have no business making a video on this considering I'm asking you this question, but, you know, why does the sarcoplasmic reticulum release these ions when this happens? And they're like, you know what? We don't know.
All right, so this is how Salman Khan learns. He immerses himself, he scaffolds, he annotates, however long it may take. He makes intuitive connections, he tries to understand why, he ponders and he makes analogies, he calls up buddies, he asks obvious questions. That's not all. After that, he makes a video and puts it out there, and people give feedback, so he goes back and changes it. That's his process. How does he want other kids to learn? Right? Just watch the video. What's wrong with that picture? What's wrong with that picture?
It has no context.
Nothing. Right? And he does, if you think about it, if you know anything from educational psychology, he does everything that educational psychology says we should do. Engage, in depth, probe, interrogate, discuss, create, take feedback, edit, change your ideas. That's how we learn. And so this is what I mean by saying the seductive reduction of other people's problems. That for somebody else to learn, it's so easy. I can just show you the video. Right? So when we look at things through this lens, sometimes as educators we forget. To understand that technology is not just technology that is embedded in social practice, that the meaning of this is not just this. There's this idea of a missed call. It happens in India and Bangladesh, Vietnam too, I think, where you call somebody and they don't pick up the phone, and that's the way you send a message because phone calls cost money. It has its own Wikipedia entry. In Bangladesh, missed calls made up 70% of cellular network traffic at any given time. It makes no sense, I think, in Australia, makes no sense in America, because the economic situation is different. So understanding the meaning of this device requires you to understand the social context within which it functions. And the biggest insight of all is that our practices through these devices, through their design, can be manipulated and our behaviors can be changed. So I want to come back to B.J. Fogg. So he did this work around what he called captology. A whole bunch of his graduates have gone and gotten jobs in Silicon Valley. And they have utilized all of these techniques to design these tools and devices. Taking insights from behavioral economics. So Richard Thaler, who wrote this book called Nudge, so 3 different covers of the same book. Richard Thaler acted as advisor to President Obama, as an economic advisor. So a simple thing. If you want people to save money for retirement, make it an opt-out, not an opt-in. Which means that by default, you're signed up for retirement plans. It's a nudge. It requires effort to opt out. Well, the New York Times does the same thing. If you are subscribed to the New York Times and you want to cancel your subscription, it's not just clicking a button. They will send you an email with a phone call that you made to somebody between such and such time in order to cancel your subscription. But very different reasons, right? In one case, you're helping people save for retirement. In another case, you're sucking them into staying and giving New York Times $20 a month or whatever it is. So, this is this whole idea of what is known as black hat manipulation. So for instance, here's one of the founders of Facebook, Sean Parker. It was designed to exploit human vulnerability. So the black hat design is deceptive use of persuasion tactics. And you add to that the gobs and gobs of data that is being generated today that can allow these companies to track and monitor every move. And when we think about educational technology in school, this is one thing we really have not thought about. That as companies like Pearson, as companies like Google are coming in. Again, I use Google, don't get me wrong. My life depends on Google at some level. But I'm also aware of what the trade-off is and the lack of choices there. So, I mean, I'm not going to go into all of these, but this is a great article by How Technology Can Get in Your Mind. And these are what I call the dark arts. You know, just like in Harry Potter, you have the dark arts. These are the dark arts. And these devices are essentially a slot machine in every body. Every behavioral trick that we know about manipulating our minds have become embedded in these. Through social approval, through fear of missing out, through that little red dot that pops up and says, oh, you got these many likes. This is all deliberately designed to manipulate us. And it happens over time, so with each new breach of trust or privacy, each feels small. Oh, they have my location, they have my identity, they're always listening. Again, this is not about fear-mongering, but this is where the world is today. And we need to approach it with an open eye. And the saddest thing, or the scariest thing about this, is that always when these technologies come about, they attack the most vulnerable amongst us. And in Australia, if you think about the indigenous populations, if you think about America, and how these technologies have been used to manipulate, to impose certain perspectives, what schooling is. I mean, there is a lot of history here, and I think that what I have become aware of is that I need to be much more aware of this history. And particularly kids, who are the most vulnerable amongst us. This is what struck me, that all of this happened while we were conducting little studies on the efficacy of online learning versus face-to-face learning or whatever. That as educators, as researchers, we missed the biggest issues and questions of our time. In fact, just this past week, I was going to write a blog post rant about this. But I didn't have this time, maybe I'll do it later today or whatever. So these guys did this study where they took like some 40 kids and gave them some VR, gave them this, and they found out that, boys learn better if it's a drone, and girls like better if the thing is a virtual girl or lady or whatever. Like 37 kids, we did this, but no question of thinking about what the deeper questions. Again, I am not a Luddite. I have a great faith in the power of technology and tools to transform the way we look at the world, the way we do things. It has transformed our lives. I understand that. I cannot live without these tools and devices because they have opened my eyes to things and ways of doing things. But the questions about AR, VR are not really about which agent it is. It really is about what does this mean for our understanding between what is real and what is not? Like, are we developing the skills to ask those questions? There's a bet that a couple of computer scientists have had with each other that within the next year, there is going to be a fake video which you will not, like about a politician, which you will not be able to tell from a real video. That technology is here today. There will be no way of determining whether it's real or not. What do we as a society do in the world? How do we train our kids to think smartly about these things? That is the challenge. So our failure, honestly, is as adults, as citizens and educators. And I think the need is truly to understand the system, to understand the culture, and through that thinking about how do we design the system, how do we design the culture. That the words design that we use thinking about artifacts, processes, experiences, we need to go beyond that. So I want to talk a little bit about my new university that I'm at. I was at Michigan State for 18 years, and now I am at Arizona State University, which defines itself as a new American university, known by who we include rather than who we exclude. That's the words of the president. And that was part of the big reason of why I moved there, because it is a very inclusive, it's not proud of the fact that we turn away so many thousands and we take just 1%. It says we take a lot and we do the best that we can with who we take in. It is also incredibly innovative as an university, #1 for 4 years or something that way. And that's the college that I'm in. And the work that we're involved in right now is what we call education by design, sort of thinking about innovation with purpose in schools and other systems. And this, by definition, is not us going and studying. It is us going and participating. It's working in partnership with schools, school districts, community members, businesses. The understanding that any educational innovation that we need to do has to be deeply embedded within the systems and culture of the place. That what we are designing are systems, not designing artifacts and tools. It's a collaborative effort, open-ended design process that respects context, diverse perspectives. And we see this as a professional learning opportunity for educators, people we work with. So we have done a whole range of these, where this is one that we did where we had 175 people in one room struggling to figure out how to turn around a school that is failing. Right? But you have to bring everybody into that conversation. And we did the same sort of sessions with teachers, with students, with kids. And what was fascinating is when we started coding these, and this coding was, by the way, done by the teachers, not by researchers going and doing it, we found these clusters that kids had a very different perspective on what success in high school meant than what parents did, than teachers did, and businesses did. None of them were wrong. But it also spoke to the fact that's why making this change happen is so difficult. Because we have fundamentally different views of what the educational goal is. It varies even in parents. It varies between, that school has a huge Hispanic population. In that big crowd of 170 plus people, no Hispanic parents showed up. They did not feel included. So we went to an evening class that they go to and did another session there. We got a completely different perspective of what they expect from their students. So this is, I think, my latest work completely, is this framework for thinking about design in education. And I think as you think about mobile technologies, or AR or VR, that this is sort of one approach that one can start thinking about. So we call this the 5 discourses of design in education. So first, we see design as being a contextually grounded, purposeful, creative, and iterative process. So each word is very intentional of identifying problems. The first part is actually identifying what the problem is. Design is not about finding a solution, it's really about identifying the right problem. Very often we don't know what the right problem is. And developing solutions to complex problems of practice in situations that are fraught with ambiguity and complexity. We are very deliberate in using the word discourse, because discourses are worldviews, these are ways of talking about the world, and different discourses often can define the same thing in very different ways. There are certain universal elements to these discourses. So we talked about that each of these levels of discourses has different kinds of knowledge, elements, practices, and I can talk a little bit more about that. So, if you look at the story that I've been trying to tell so far, when I started from my undergraduate engineering and my work in design school, was looking at artifacts, right? Whether it's a piece of software or whether it was a book or a text, we talked about this designing of processes, experiences, systems, and culture. And that as we go along this dimension, problems get more and more wicked. Like defining how we think about culture when it comes to how these mobile devices will fit in a classroom is a very different story than designing an app. I'm not saying designing an app is easy, but designing the culture or the system within which that app will function is far more wicked. So, this is work that this is sort of my most recent work, looking at this idea of design across these levels. And what was interesting for me was seeing like my personal sort of journey as going across these levels. And I think that when I think of the TPAC framework, at the most it touches artifacts and processes, maybe even experiences. And in fact, we just are writing a paper now about why the TPAC framework, though I strongly believe in it, I think it's really powerful, did not have the impact that it should have had. And the reason it did not is because I didn't understand it, I don't think Matt understood it, because we were not thinking about systems and culture within which that would function. And that if, as each of us as educators thinks about these tools, technologies, pedagogical practices, and we want to embed them, we have to think about systems and we have to think about culture. But think about what that means. It means you have to understand the nature of power in these organizations. You have to understand the soft and hard networks that exist if you want to leverage change. You are now thinking at the level of a system. And very often in teacher preparation, we are not training them to think that way. We are training them to work in a classroom, not understanding or not being sensitive to, let me put it that way, to the fact that they live within a broader system and that if they have to affect change in their classroom, they better get smart about how change works organizationally. Right? And I think that it changes the kinds of questions we ask in research. Too much of our research has been this, while the thing around us has been crazy. So, to end, there are many reasons for the global challenges we face today, and a key among them, I argue, has been a failure to imagine what education can be. The issue is not as much access to schooling. This is primary school enrollment. We are actually doing very well worldwide. I mean, there are places where we can do better. But kids in India, there was a Right to School Act. So by law, if you are a certain age, like below 10 years of age, there has to be a school within walking distance. Right? Fine. We are getting it. But here's the problem. Despite being in school, barely half of the world's children achieve maximum proficiency in reading and math. 670 million children are unable to read at an appropriate level. So this is failure at a systemic level. We have by design or circumstance an educational ecology that does not meet the needs of the present, let alone of the future that you talked about, right? So I think it's time that we rethink some of our approaches. So this is Mark Zuckerberg and move fast and break things, and I think that has led to a lot of the disasters that we see around us. I think it's time that we go slow and fix things. And again, this does not mean that we don't take advantage of these tools and the opportunities that they provide us, but that we are thoughtful in how we do it. And to understand, we should never lose sight of the fact that children and teachers in classrooms are conscious, sentient, purposeful beings. So no scientific explanation of human behavior could ever be complete. In fact, no unpoetic description of the human condition can ever be complete. So as we think about our research, how do we bring the humanistic into that? And you showed the pictures of your kids, John. Here are my kids. So those are two photographs, obviously badly manipulated in Photoshop, of their first day of school and their last day of school. So my kids are a little younger than Sean's and our kids. So what's funny to me is the expression on both the little ones. It's like, oh my God, 12 years of this. And how excited they are to get out. So I think about that, right? I mean, the world that they're growing up in and the world that they are co-creating. I mean, 8th grade, watching the movie, I mean, it just brought home to me. I mean, there are these moments there where the dad just doesn't understand. He's trying really hard. And I'm like, man, we've lived through those moments. We are still living through them in some ways. And those are real, they're powerful, and they're poignant. So, thinking about this, that as we think about technology, that we go beyond sort of thinking about the artifacts and the processes and experiences. Start thinking in terms of systems, start thinking in terms of culture. And that maybe we have a course called Defense Against the Dark Arts. I've actually considered offering a class like this. You know, because Severus Snape has this great quote, which I think is very true of how these devices have been designed. And I do hope that at the end of the day, each one of us in some ways leaves it better than we found it. Thank you.